It's late afternoon. The sun's shadows are across the lawn. It's a beautiful cemetery. It's got a really peaceful feeling to it.
Yeah, there's something about the space. They've got gum trees, but also that sort of subtropical, almost tropical vegetation you'll see in Caribbean cemeteries with that same calm.
My co-producer Ben Etherington and I have just arrived at Toowong Cemetery in Brisbane, where the great 19th century Caribbean Australian boxer Peter Jackson is buried.
I'm Ben.
We spot the site operations manager, Chad, and ask for directions. And we were looking for the grave of this guy called Peter Jackson.
Yeah.
Do you know where that is?
I do. Okay. Actually, let me just go and get the key to drive you guys up there.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Most people have never heard of Peter Jackson, unless you're talking about the Kiwi film director. But in the early 1890s, at the height of Peter Jackson's boxing career, he was the most famous Australian person in the world.
So do you know much about Peter Jackson?
Not really. Like, all what I heard is just the normal story. Because our first heavyweight champion in Australia here, and he's originally from Toowoomba.
He's actually from a Caribbean island called St Croix. This guy from Barbados, Jack Dowridge, he owned a hotel and he was a boxing promoter in the 1880s and 1890s.
Yeah.
And he bought a plot here for himself and his family. And when Peter Jackson was destitute, didn't have any money, didn't have any family, Jack Dowridge gave him one of the plots for his family to be buried here. Wow. Yeah.
Hi. Lovely to meet you.
Pleasure meeting you guys.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Best of luck.
Yeah. Oh, look, someone's actually left some boxing gloves.
These are bright red, brand new Fila gloves. Someone hasn't just chucked some old second-hand gloves on the grave. These are spanking new, so it would have cost them, I don't know how much.
So it looks like people are still coming to Jackson's tombstone to honour him, just like those who attended its unveiling back in 1903. Welcome to Caribbean Echoes, a UTS Impact Studios History Lab series about Caribbean people in Australia. My name's Sienna Brown. I'm a Caribbean Australian writer who was born in Kingston, Jamaica and lived in Canada before moving to Sydney. In Canada, there's a whole heap of us Caribbean people, but I soon discovered that here in Australia, it's very different. We're always on the edges, trying to establish ourselves, while retaining our own very distinct culture. We can often find it harder than larger migrant groups to forge a place in the Australian story. And with my family living on the other side of the world, this feeling of isolation sent me back again and again into Australia's past to unearth life stories of some of the Caribbean men and women who arrived long before I did. Some were famous in their lifetimes, others were everyday people, but they've all contributed to Australia's cultural fabric. In this series, we're spotlighting the lives of two eminent Caribbean Australians, the boxer Peter Jackson and the entertainer Nellie Small. In companion episodes, we look at other Caribbean migrant stories from the 19th century while considering their broader political and social contexts. This includes interrelations between First Nations communities and the Caribbean diaspora. Now let's take a look at the remarkable life story of one of those Caribbean Australians, Peter Jackson.
As a young boy boxing fan, I remember there was a great movie starring Errol Flynn called Gentleman Jim, which is about James J. Corbett, who have fought Peter Jackson and have celebrated 61-round draw, one of the great boxing bouts of the early history of world boxing. And that's probably where I first heard about Peter Jackson.
When I first came across Peter Jackson, I had little interest in boxing. And I'm finding it ironic that through my search for fellow Caribbean Australians, a whole new sporting world is being opened up to me.
I originally started looking at boxer Jack Johnson, who's much more popular in the United States because he defeated a white boxer to become the world heavyweight champion. And I really kind of stumbled across Peter Jackson and really starting to question, who is this person that I'm seeing everywhere?
I really started to get a sense of who Peter Jackson was from a very detailed biography by Australian academic and historian Bob Peterson. On the cover of Peterson's book, there's an image of an absolutely stunning-looking coffee-coloured guy. He's naked from the waist up, his arms folded across his well-developed chest. My God, what a spunk! And there's something in his bearing that identifies him to me as having Caribbean heritage.
He, as a child, would have seen a boxing match prior to leaving on a ship. And you have to know how to defend yourself on the streets. And that's not just by your mouth. You have to put up your fists. You have to know how to throw a good rock stone and protect yourself. So I am going to say to you in this narrative...
So how did Peter Jackson, who was born 10,000 miles away on the tiny Caribbean island of St Croix, become one of Australia's great boxing champions? And why don't more Australians know his story? I also want to understand what stopped him from becoming the first black man to win the heavyweight championship of the world, 2 decades before Jack Johnson eventually achieved that feat. Using my expertise as a historical novelist, I'll also go beyond what's available in public records to explore his inner life through fictional recreation, imagining what he might have thought or felt, a kind of ghost Peter brought to life by actor Alpha Kagbo.
Hello, my name is Peter Jackson. I was born on the island of St Croix on the 23rd of September 1860. Jumped ship in Sydney, trained to be a boxer, and after beating a guy called Tom Lees, I won the Australian Heavyweight Boxing Championship. But don't let my race fist fool you. I've played many roles. A boxer, a swimmer, an actor, a hotelier. But understand this, the role I play best is a gentleman. That is really who I am.
We've just arrived in Brisbane and we're standing outside the State Library of Queensland.
We're meeting the renowned boxing expert Grantlee Kieza. Remarkably, we're in the South Bank, which is South Brisbane, and actually Peter Jackson passed through South Brisbane in his final months of life. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk to Grantlee. Let's head in.
Yeah, my name is Grantlee Kieza. I was inducted into the Australian Boxing Hall of Fame 2017, and I was a sports writer for about 40 years, and I helped train some great Australian boxers, Jeff Fennick. And I always had an affinity with the history of boxing. In fact, the very first feature article I ever wrote for a newspaper was on Peter Jackson, and I just thought it was extraordinary that one of the all-time boxing greats was buried right in not far from where I lived.
Okay, so please take us back to 1879, the year Peter jumped ship in Port Jackson. What was Sydney like at that time?
Sydney at the time was a city of about 200,000 people. It was a cosmopolitan place, and there were all sorts of entertainments, and there was theatres, there was horse racing, there were all sorts of sports events, and of course it had a big boxing community. You see, boxing in the late 1800s was also a way for people to make very good money. So someone like Peter Jackson, who wasn't a skilled worker, when he arrived in Australia, he was doing lots of different labouring jobs. He was working on boats, and he was working as an axeman, and he was selling little toys and whatever from a stall. But boxing, he could make really, really good coin. Larry Foley, who ran the most famous boxing gymnasium in Sydney, and himself was a gangland figure, he decided to become Peter Jackson's trainer and manager. He hadn't had any professional fights at the time, but he saw him in a brawl down at what's now Wynyard Square, where the Wynyard train station is in Sydney, and he was fighting these gangs of thugs led by a guy called Long Alf, and they're part of, as I say, it was gangs of New York kind of territory.
Yeah.
This gang was led by Long Alf, but they were part of the bigger gang run by Dixon the dog hanger. So these are real Dickensian, as I say, gangs of New York type thugs. And Peter Jackson was taking on 7 at a time and beating them all, knocking them all down. So Larry Foley offered to step in and help, and according to the legends, or according to Foley's story, which may have been embellished, Peter Jackson said, no, I can handle this, fair play, I want a fair fight. And he beat all the 7 attackers. And from that moment, Larry Foley knew that he had a budding great champion on his hands.
Right from the get-go, Peter is establishing himself as a hero of sorts. The sense I get is he not only had an innate confidence in himself, but held a strong belief about how to behave in the world. And each situation he found himself in, he just dealt with it.
How did I learn how to fight? On the streets of my hometown in St Croix. It's what was expected of you if you were the eldest. Defend the weaker ones, protect them against the bullies. It's in my blood. Fear is fear. It's a motto I've held on to my whole life. Why let the cowards get away with it? Show them what it means to be a man of honor. Show them that you can be a boxer as well as a gentleman.
His early fights would have only been little more than exhibition kind of fights, but within 4 years of having his first professional fight, he beat a guy called Tom Lees in the 30th round for the Australian heavyweight title. And that was a big, significant milestone because, as I say, in the 1880s, boxing was a very big sport in Australia. In fact, it's really only been the last, 30 or 40 years that football has dominated to the way it does now. Boxing was the king of the sports in Australia, and Peter Jackson was the king of boxing for a long time.
Fast. Last night I cut the light off in my bedroom, hit the switch, was in the bed before the room was dark. Incredible. Fast.
Jackson was regarded as what you would say a real scientific boxer, a guy that used speed, a sort of a Muhammad Ali kind of fighter. He was a very entertaining boxer with those skills rather than just an animalistic brawling style. You know, boxing's often called the noble art of self-defence, and it's very much a style of make the opponent miss and counter-punch and a lot of footwork.
Right. So how long after he got his title would he have stuck around, or is that when he started to look at maybe moving somewhere else?
Australia was a long way from the United States and from England, but newspapers only took a few weeks to arrive there, and his exploits were gaining great attention. And in 1888, 2 years after he won the Australian heavyweight title, he headed for San Francisco to forge a career there, and he was very much accepted there as the great conquering hero from down under.
During my research, I also discovered that Peter, just before leaving Australia, entered a major sporting event in Sydney. Not boxing, but a swimming competition that marked the founding of the Port Jackson Swimming Club. He easily defeated the other competitors by winning the distance diving competition with a dive of 80 yards. Peter somehow managed to not only survive in Australia, but thrive in a country under white colonial rule. Even so, he constantly experienced blatant racism, especially in the ring. So how would he survive in the US, where he would surely face just as much prejudice, maybe even more? To explore the world Peter entered, I speak with Jordana Moore Saggese, a professor of modern and contemporary American art at the University of Maryland. She's just published a book about photographic representations of black boxers in the United States, and one of her main subjects is her very own Peter Jackson.
Yeah, so when he arrives in San Francisco, it is a very different city than what we think of when we think of the United States in 1888. Boxing is not forced out of the city limits in the ways that it is in New York and Philadelphia and Boston. In sort of the East Coast of the United States, boxing is seen as immoral, it is illegal, it's taking place on barges in the middle of bodies of water. But in San Francisco, it's embraced. It's actually called the Cradle of the Fistic Stars.
I love that. The Cradle of the Fistic Stars.
Right, because there's so many boxers that are living in San Francisco at this moment because it is such a tolerant atmosphere.
And how did Peter Jackson come to your attention in the first place?
I originally started looking at boxer Jack Johnson, who's much more popular in the United States because he defeated a white boxer to become the world heavyweight champion. And I really kind of stumbled across Peter Jackson, seeing him in newspapers and on tobacco cards, and really starting to question, who is this person that I'm seeing everywhere in the late 19th century? What's really intriguing about Peter Jackson is the ways in which he's being described is absolutely counter to what we think about as representations of Blackness in the United States in this period, which we think of as just lynching photographs, right? Very debased, stereotypical images. And instead, we have this singular man who's sort of held up as this paragon of beauty. The most striking for me is their images of him circulating nude, which, in the context of the U.S. in that period, this is radical that we would have a Black man nude on the front page of a newspaper. And it's part of an illustration of a debate taking place about who has the most beautiful body, who is the perfect man.
Jordana, this is fascinating. I mean, Australia and the US were both racist societies, yet somehow Peter received massive public adulation. In Australia, I get it, I understand. He was part of our national obsession with sport. But in the US, how was it that he could be so celebrated, especially with slavery being such a recent memory? Did he somehow present himself in a specific way?
There's a lot of documentation of Jackson talking to the press about his choice to become a boxer, which is really interesting. He's very careful to position himself as someone who is well educated, right? He's speaking with this beautiful lilting accent. He's quoting Shakespeare and Tennyson. And so talking to the press, they are absolutely positively fascinated with him. They call him Gentleman Jackson. They call him the Black Prince, these sort of aristocratic monikers.
They call me the Black Prince or Gentleman Jackson. And I'm happy to be labeled this way rather than only a boxer, a man who uses his fist to make a living, as if that is the only thing a man of my race can do. After all, anything that will encourage people to look beyond the color of skin and see how, as humans, we inhabit all the colors of the rainbow. It's a good thing.
We have images that we know he had made of himself in London, where he's dressed up as a dandy, right? Wearing a three-piece suit and a pocket watch. He takes great pains to do things like put his hands in his pocket, glove his hands, right? And presenting himself as a gentleman. He had a lot of agency in creating those photographs. Jackson is coming up in a moment where people as a whole are beginning to realize the power of photography to remake their image. Representation as reconstruction. Reconstruction really being that very messy period in the United States after the Civil War, where slaves are trying to integrate into mainstream society, right? The first time that they're representing themselves rather than represented by white painters, for example. So in a lot of ways, I think that Jackson's appropriation of the sort of gentleman qualities, this is very much of the moment of the 1870s and 1880s in particular.
Peter was definitely in the right place at the right time. And as a migrant myself, instinctively, I can relate to his desire to belong, to adapt, to position himself in a certain way. And I think for Caribbean people, perhaps because of the residual trauma of a Creole plantation slave society, our way of adapting is to duck and weave in between the lines. And that's the masking we develop, a blessing and a curse, because it sometimes makes it hard to reveal our authentic selves. In Peter's case, being a gentleman not only suited his personality, but was something he would have aspired to become.
No matter how far I travel from my little island of St Croix, underneath in my heart, I'll always be a proud Caribbean man. A man born in the tropics, with a lilt to his voice, a lightness of my steps, head on bow. Always held high, to slip and slide my way through whatever circumstance I find myself in. It's how I survive.
Caribbean people, if you're into cricket, you know us as West Indians, who come from islands scattered throughout the Caribbean Sea, which is situated between North and South America. Like Australia, we are the product of colonial rule. For us, though, there were several colonial powers, especially the Spanish, the British, the Dutch, and the French. But Peter Jackson's tiny island of St Croix, it was then under Danish rule. And I'm starting to realize that for me to get a deeper sense of who Peter really was, it's time for me to visit his birthplace. As soon as I step off the plane in St Croix, every part of my being relaxes. I find myself immersed in the sweet smell of the tropics and feel myself reconnecting with a way of being in the world, secure and confident. And even though it's not Jamaica, I'm delighted to be back in the Northern Hemisphere, where July matches my biological memory of the blazing heat of a summer's day. I swim effortlessly in gentle warm waters, thankful not to be buffeted by the bracing cold waves patrolling Sydney beaches, and try to walk in Peter's footsteps, exploring the places he might have seen. However, when Peter walked these beaches in the 1860s, slavery was a recent memory, having been abolished in St Croix in 1848. Close to the beach where I'm swimming is Fort Frederiksted, an impressive fortress with towering, vibrant redstone walls, cannons lined up encircling the bay, which the Danish built to defend the island against pirates. Myron Jackson, a historian and former U.S. Virgin Islands senator, suggested that we meet there because it's where Peter, in 1871, would have first left St Croix as a 10-year-old. I asked Myron about the kind of upbringing Peter would have had and whether it prepared him for his boxing career.
I have to say to you that boxing was done here in Frederiksted. So he, as a child, would have seen a boxing match prior to leaving on a ship. And you have to know how to defend yourself on the streets. If you were older in the family, it was your responsibility to protect your brothers and sisters, and that's not just by your mouth. You have to put up your fist. You have to know how to throw a good rock stone. You have to know how to take a stick and maybe do some stick fighting, take up a conch shell, whatever it is, and protect yourself.
That makes me really curious, though, because when he arrived in the US and started to give interviews, the press were absolutely fascinated by the fact of how well educated he sounded. So could you give us a little bit of an overview of what the education system was like in those days?
In the Danish West Indies, we had compulsory education prior to emancipation. It was required that enslaved children go to school. And that is being done by the Moravian missionaries for the most part because they came here in 1732. And so his life is also tied to this Moravian history.
And what was life like in the town when Peter was born?
It was an industry based on sugar production and rum production and the export of it. And the town of Frederiksted that he grew up in was the center of that economy. Our ancestors were the working class who provided the labor of the sugarcane fields for planting, for harvesting, for production of rum. Ships going in and out, stevedores and sailors that looked like him were on these ships, so to travel the world. That is an opportunity many dream of.
Peter was only 10 years old when he joined the shipping business. I mean, I'm trying to imagine what it was like for him, spending weeks on board his ship.
You have to remember that age 10, you are prepared for manhood. You're not a little boy, and you have to work to help the family, to put that food on the table and to live. You sit on the dock, you see how beautiful this town is, and You dream of other locations. You see people coming and going. Why not?
After I left St Croix, I returned a couple of times. But every time I did, things in my hometown were worse and worse. They suffered a hurricane, a fire. The town burned to the ground. All kinds of miseries. The further I traveled, the more difficult it became to see St Croix as home. After all, I've been out in the world from when I was only a child. So I kept going, carrying with me a lingering memory of the scent of oranges.
After leaving St Croix, Peter Jackson spent 8 years at sea, stopping in places like Denmark, India, Java, the Dutch West Indies, eventually disembarking in New York, where he'd been told his brother had settled. But alas, he couldn't find him, and perhaps that's why he continued to work as a seaman until 1879. That's the year he arrived in Sydney Harbour on board the H.J. Libby, where, due to ill treatment on board, he jumped ship and swam to shore. And the rest, as you've heard earlier, becomes history. Having gained an understanding of all the experiences that shaped Peter as he rose to become the famous gentleman boxer, let's return to Grantlee Kieza to talk about the 2 fights that made him a legend in his time. Earlier, Grantlee told us that he first discovered Peter Jackson in the Errol Flynn movie Gentleman Jim, which features the famous 1891 fight at the California Athletic Club between Peter and the white boxer James J. Corbett, the match that went for 61 rounds. And just so for someone who doesn't know anything about boxing, how long would that have taken?
Yeah, well, that would be at least three and a half hours of actual fighting.
Right,
So
right.
Just incredible contest. Yeah, incredible. They were both so exhausted and so bloodied and so beaten they couldn't lift their arms up anymore, and the referee stepped in and declared it a draw. So, that gives you an indication of just how tough and how determined these guys were, and how much Peter Jackson really wanted to be the best in the world.
I hope to have the pleasure of again meeting James J. Corbett in the ring. Not that I have any feeling of animosity toward him. On the contrary, I like him very much. I have an admiration for his skill and courage as a fighter, but I yield to no man. I am simply desirous of proving who is the champion pugilist of the world.
And the second, even more famous legendary fight was with Frank Slavin, a blacksmith from Maitland, New South Wales, who ended up becoming a Canadian Mountie.
On the evening of May the 30th, 1892, there was only one place to be, 43 King Street, the Covent Garden home of the National Sporting Club. The club offered a 5 shilling and 4 dinner of chops, chips and beer. But what drew the crowds that Monday was the promise of the greatest boxing event ever.
So the next year, he's at Covent Garden in London and he's fighting a huge fight. He's defending his Commonwealth heavyweight title against a very tough Aussie named Frank Paddy Slavin. It was very well known that he had a great dislike for Peter Jackson and used a lot of racial comments against him.
And the night was a study in contrasts. Peter Jackson, known as the Black Prince, dressed in white. Frank Slavin wore dark blue. Jackson was slim and beautifully proportioned, but it was Slavin with his smouldering, deep sunken eyes, leonine mane, fierce moustache, and hairy chest and arms who was the model of Victorian masculinity. He was also an unabashed racist who declared that to be beaten by a blackfellow, however good a fellow, is a pill I shall never swallow. He and Jackson fought for a purse of £2,000. June the 1st, 1892. The Financial Times.
And that was a real grudge fight. It really was. I mean, there's a lot of hype in boxing to say this boxer hates that boxer. But in those days, it really was genuine. They'd been bitter enemies for a long time. And Slavin made no bones about his racism. He didn't think that he belonged in the sport and he didn't belong in the ring with him. And Jackson set about to prove otherwise. And he gave Paddy Slavin a flogging and stopped him in the 10th round.
I tell you what, beating Paddy Slavin, I had no choice. There was no way I was going to let him off the hook, especially after all the nasty things he said about me. I gave him a flogging, and that's what he deserved. I can't tell you how many people came up to me in the streets and shook my hand and said, "Well done, son. You proved that a black man can actually beat the best white boxer at the game."
Well, he did have some very big fights, but he couldn't get the main one. The guy that he really wanted to fight was John L. Sullivan, the heavyweight champion of the world, the man who boasted that he could lick any son of a bitch in the world. James J. Corbett ended up beating Sullivan for the heavyweight title. And when he did that, he said that Peter Jackson could have beaten Sullivan just as easily, but he never got the opportunity. And that was constantly a great frustration for Peter Jackson, of course, because he wanted to be king of the world and Sullivan drew the colour bar.
The colour bar was a term used to describe practices of racial segregation. Basically, Sullivan was using racist norms to avoid having to face Jackson in the ring. Nevertheless, Peter's matches continued to attract huge crowds, not just in the UK, but also in the US, as he crisscrossed the Atlantic. By the end of 1892, he's fought over 28 fights and lost none. Then, Peter's career took an unexpected turn. He went into acting. I certainly didn't see that coming. But I learned that this wasn't unusual for 19th century boxers, who often leveraged their fame to earn money in the theatre. For Peter, though, the choices were limited. One of the few roles for black actors at the time was Othello by Shakespeare, and that wasn't an option. So he agreed to perform in a theatrical adaptation of Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Uncle Tom's Cabin is a novel published by Harriet Beecher Stowe in the period after the Civil War. It was so controversial because of its celebrations of slavery. Some of the characters within it are sort of fitting these stereotypes that we talk about in the United States as sort of the happy darky, someone who's ignorant and is going to be benefited by the protection and guidance of slave masters, which sounds so ridiculous to us now, but audiences in the 19th century who were in some ways nostalgic for slavery really lapped this up.
Hearing about this from Jordana, I experienced so many different emotions. I feel confronted, confused, fascinated by his behaviour, to not only choose to perform in such a racist play, but to also play the central character of old Uncle Tom, the sellout slave, especially after so carefully projecting the image of an upper-class gentleman.
This is really the most puzzling part of Jackson's career, and it is, I think, more than anything, indicative of his complete misunderstanding of racial politics in the United States.
Bob Peterson, in his biography, suggests that Peter agreed to do it because he thought he could subvert the play by introducing a boxing round in the intermission.
We have several examples of boxers in the 1880s who, in between their matches, actually go on the road and perform in plays. The exception is that these boxers, all of them are white, are performing in plays that were specifically written for them. Jackson is the only boxer that is touring in these productions, but not playing himself, playing this sort of literary character. So I do wonder about their efficacy to undermine the character that he's playing throughout the entire rest of the play.
I have to admit, unlike preparing for a boxing match, I didn't prepare myself for what performing in that play would do to me. Nevertheless, Experience is a good teacher, and for that, I will always be grateful. Over the years, I've made a lot of money, and no man can say I owe him a cent. I've never asked for charity, and I've been overly generous to my friends. While I had it, it was theirs for the asking.
After the tour of Uncle Tom's Cabin ended, Peter returned to boxing. But he wasn't the man he was 10 years before. His health was in decline, and he continued to be denied the chance to achieve his main goal, becoming heavyweight boxing champion of the world.
He became extremely frustrated, Peter Jackson. He probably started drinking. He took a long break from boxing, and when he decided to come back, he was really only a shell of the man that had beaten Paddy Slaven. He'd taken a bit of punishment in that fight too. He ended up taking on the young tiger that was on the way up, a guy who was a lot bigger than him, and a lot more powerful and a lot younger, and his name was James J. Jeffries, who ended up becoming heavyweight champion of the world for a long, long time. And Peter Jackson really shouldn't have been in the ring with him. He needed the money, and he took an absolute hiding himself and really suffered as a result of that. And that was really the beginning of the end for Peter Jackson.
Learning of Peter's decline left me feeling pretty down. Here was a fellow Caribbean person who had the potential to reach the greatest of heights. And what stopped him from achieving this was the colour of his skin. And it seems no matter how successful Peter was at ducking and weaving and masking himself, in the end it was prejudice that felled him. I've experienced only a limited amount of blatant racism, and when I have, it's extremely unsettling. So I can imagine how devastating it would have been to be denied your life's ambition. It means Peter beating Paddy Slaven would end up being the highest achievement of his career. As to those white boxers who refused to fight him, especially John L. Sullivan, they should be remembered as cowards and white supremacists, not world champions. As the turn of the century rolled in, Peter was staying in Denver, Colorado, broke and living off the charity of good friends. In a letter he wrote on February the 1st, 1900, he explained,
I have a severe cough and suffering with pains in my left side and also a shortness of breath. And I cannot walk faster than a child. But I hope, with good care, to be a well man again, to be back in the country, which I consider my home.
Peter's prayers were finally answered, and money was raised so he could travel. He left the US on March 24th, 1900, and arrived in Sydney a month later. Now, according to newspaper reports, he was bone thin and barely able to walk. His friends greeted him at the dock and had to help him to shore. But Peter didn't stay long in Sydney because his health didn't return. So he checked into a sanatorium in Roma, a small country town in Queensland. Decades later, an article on Jackson in a local Roma newspaper, the Western Star, featured recollections of his short time in the community.
Peter Jackson's arrival in Roma created quite a stir, and a gala reception was accorded to him at his arrival at Argyle Cottage, where a number of friends gathered to honour the worthy gentleman. They danced until the early hours to the shrill of bagpipes, and before his demise, when Mr. Jackson was well enough, he enjoyed to go duck hunting.
What an image! There's Peter Jackson at 40 years old, a retired boxer, a champion, a gentleman, going duck hunting in rural Queensland. But I guess it's where he felt he belonged. After all, Australia was a place where he'd been welcomed, admired, and very much celebrated.
Friday, 19 July 1901, Brisbane Courier. It will be heard with great regret in many circles far beyond Brisbane that Peter Jackson, the great coloured boxer born in St Croix, finally succumbed to consumption, and he died at Roma at 10 o'clock on Saturday evening last. Jackson was 40 years old, and in his time he'd met all the best men of the world in the ring, and only twice did he suffer defeat.
Peter's time in Roma was the last great round in the cycle of his life. His health declined and he died 10 days after his 40th birthday on the 13th of July, 1901.
Yesterday afternoon, a crowd numbering thousands assembled at Toowong Cemetery to witness the unveiling of a memorial erected by public subscription over the remains of the late Peter Jackson, the famous coloured boxer. When the funding committee arrived, the cemetery was so packed, a struggle had to be made to reach a point of vantage. The Brisbane Courier, 1903.
So we're looking up the hill at Peter Jackson's grave, and the sun is setting behind it through the trees, and there's a kind of mottled light filtering over it. I think what we're looking at on this side is a poem that was dedicated to Jackson upon his death. Can you make it out?
Sleep, Peter, sleep, brave champion. All hushed, we gather round the ring. The fight is done. Sleep, Peter, sleep. The heroes rest. Be thine in Mother Earth's broad breast. That's lovely. As Ben and I leave the cemetery, I have an overwhelming feeling of gratitude, knowing that Peter is being looked after and cared for in this majestic place. I can now walk away from his story with a good feeling in my heart, inspired by the fact that a fellow Australian who came from this tiny, tiny island in the Caribbean left behind a huge legacy. And as more people rediscover his story, I hope he's rightfully recognised as an Australian icon.